Hello everyone! In this lesson we will continue to build out the styles for our travel website. Let's dive right in. So in this lesson we are going to continue styling this content. If we look at the design file, we see that that content is supposed to look like this. So in this lesson, let's begin with this typography, the text styles for these headlines. Let's begin by finding these elements in our HTML. We can find them by searching for the first trip. So over in our text editor, in the HTML file, I will push Command F. If you're using Windows, you could try Control F and then just search for the first trip. All right, so here are those elements. We want to give them classes so we can begin styling them. So what should we name these classes? Well, instead of treating this like a unique section, I'm going to create a generic reusable headline block because we see these headlines, and if we scroll down a bit, we also see a very similar headline here. So in our HTML, let's go ahead and give all three of those elements a class of headline. Let me just copy and paste this onto this element and also this heading. All right, now let's go ahead and create a new CSS file that is dedicated to our new headline block. So in the app assets folder, within the styles folder, and then within the modules folder, let's create a new file, and let's name this new file _headline.css. Let's create a class named headline, and let's begin styling. So let's treat this style as our baseline for the headline block, and then we can just use a few modifier classes to create these styles. So if we compare this to what we see in the browser, I think the first thing that we should change is make the heading so it's not so bold. So in our text editor, let's say font weight 300. Let's save this, but before we can expect this change to show up in the browser, we need to go into our main styles.css file and import this new headline file. So it lives in the modules folder and its name is _headline. Let's save this and check out the browser. All right, that looks a lot better. I think the next thing we should change is to increase the font size to match the design file. So let's go ahead and measure the font size on this baseline headline block style. I will measure from the top of a capital letter down to the bottom of a letter that has a descender. So that looks like about 46 pixels tall. But remember, we want to define our font sizes in terms of rem. So let's open our calculator and take 46 and divide it by 16. So that gives us 2.875 rem. So I will copy that value into my clipboard, and then back in our headline.css file, let's say font size, paste it in, rem. Let's save this and check out the browser. That looks a lot better. Next, let's make the baseline color for this block blue instead of black. Color. Let's use our main blue variable. Perfect. Now let's start working on modifier classes for these two elements. So if we look at our design file, we see that the two of those headlines should be centered horizontally. So in our HTML, on those two elements, let's add a modifier class of headline --centered. All right, and then in our CSS file, let's create a modifier rule, centered, text align, center. Perfect. And if we look at our design file, we see that the second headline should be orange. So in our HTML, let's add another modifier class on this element named headline --orange. And then in our CSS file, we can create another modifier rule, --orange. Color should use our main orange variable. Perfect. Now if we compare this to the design file, we see that this headline should also have a bit smaller of a font size than the others. So in our HTML, let's create another modifier class named headline --small. And then in our CSS file, let's create another modifier rule, font size, and let's go to our design file and measure the font size for this element. So I will measure from the top of this B letter to the bottom of a descender in the letter Y. And that looks like about 30 pixels tall, but we want that in terms of rem. So in our calculator, let's clear that out and take 30, divide it by 16. Let's copy that value to our clipboard. And then in our CSS, let's paste it in and say rem. Save that, check it out in the browser. Excellent. If we compare this to the design file, we see that the small orange headline should also be wrapped onto a second line. So to create that effect, we can simply apply a maximum width to this element. So let's give it a max width of about 500 pixels. So in our HTML, let's add another modifier class to that element of headline -- narrow. And then in our CSS, let's create a modifier rule, narrow, max width, 500 pixels. Save that. All right, so that dropped the text down to a second line, but now we want this 500 pixel element to be horizontally centered itself. So we can just say margin left auto, margin right auto. Excellent. Let's compare this to the design file once again. So if you look really closely, you can see that these two headlines use a slightly lighter or thinner font weight than this headline. So to implement that difference, let's add a modifier class to the top two headlines of headline -- light. So I'll copy this, paste it onto this headline as well. And in our CSS, let's create another modifier rule, -- light, font weight 100. So this is a super thin, light font weight. Let's save that and check out the browser. Perfect. Let's compare this to the design file. And the only thing left that I see is that certain words need to be bold. So let's go ahead and bold these key phrases. In our HTML, we want to bold the phrase was our own. So let's wrap that in a strong tag. All right, and then within this headline, we want to make the phrase better for everyone bold. So let's wrap that in a strong tag as well. Let's save that and check out the browser. Looks good. And one other thing that I'm noticing is that I think we should decrease the margin below the first headline, and I think we should increase the margin below this second headline. So to do that, let's add on a few new modifier classes. So in our HTML on the first headline, let's add a new modifier class named headline -- b margin for bottom margin, b margin small. And on the second headline, let's add a modifier class of headline -- b margin large. Let's save this and create those two modifier classes in our headline CSS file. So b margin small, margin bottom. Let's go with 0.5 em. I like to define margin on my text elements in em instead of rem. The nice thing about using em in this context is that it's relative to the font size of the element itself, which means we can reuse this class on headlines that have different font sizes, and this will always scale with it really nicely. Let's create another modifier class where we add extra bottom margin, so b margin large. Let's say margin bottom 1.6 em. And before I save this, let me resize my text editor so we can see the change happen in real time. So as soon as I save, you saw the spacing change here. It's subtle, but I think it looks a lot better now. So at this point, we've completed the styling for the headlines. Now let's change gears. I think the next thing we should do is center this image horizontally. But really quickly, before we do that, I want to address a potential concern you might have with all of the modifier classes we created for the headlines. So for example, you might be thinking, wow, that is a lot of modifier classes that we just created. Instead of creating all of those modifier classes, couldn't we have just created a unique class just for this heading, and a unique class just for this heading, and a unique class just for this heading? Well, my answer to that is yes, absolutely, we could have done that. There's no right or wrong way to structure your CSS. But I do want to give you a little bit of insight into why I think this modifier system makes sense. So for example, on a larger website that might have hundreds and hundreds of pages, the designer on our team might regularly send us new styles for us to develop. And if we are not using the modifier system, I feel like it can become a bit exhausting to continually come up with new, unique class names. Now, in the example that we were just working on, it wouldn't have been that bad. We could have named this one maybe main heading. We could have named this one subheading, and maybe named this one alternate heading. But on larger websites that have more pages and more headline styles, I feel like creating single, monolithic, unique classes like that can become exhausting and result in disorganized code, right? Because as those headline classes add up over time, main heading, subheading, alternate heading, impact heading, emphasis heading, tiny heading, eventually you will reach a point where those class names don't mean anything to you. There are just too many of them. And if in 6 months or a year from now, the designer on your team comes to you with a new style for you to develop, you might recognize one of the headlines as a style that you've coded in the past, but you can't remember which class name that even was. And you don't want to be in a situation where it takes you more time to dig through all of your class names to find the right one than it would take you to just create a brand new class name, super awesome magic heading, and just rewrite the necessary CSS right then and there. That is how huge, disorganized spaghetti CSS files that are impossible to maintain are created. But if we were using the modifier system, the designer could come to us a year or even 2 years down the road with a new style for us to develop, and we could just look at the new headline style and say, okay, can we create this new style by mixing and matching and combining any of our existing modifiers? If we can, excellent. If we can't, we'll just create a new modifier or two. We know exactly where to write that new code, we will know exactly where to find it down the road, and our class names have inherent meaning, right? So which one of these naming systems is easier to understand? High impact headline or headline, headline large, headline orange? I feel like the modifier system will make sense to us even if we have to revisit the project years down the road. Those class names will always make sense and they're easy to reuse and recycle. All right, so my apologies for the huge tangent on class names. Again, there's no right or wrong way to structure your CSS, but I do encourage you to give the whole block element modifier way of thinking about things a real try before you dismiss it. For the time being, let's get back to the task at hand. We want to horizontally center this image. Now, in our previous lesson, we already created a class named wrapper that centers our content in the middle 1200 pixels of the page. So why don't we go ahead and wrap this image in the wrapper class and then create a new modifier to make it a bit narrower. So in our HTML, here is that image. Let's go ahead and wrap it in a div with a class of wrapper. Be sure to indent this. All right, now if we save this, we see that the baseline wrapper class only indented it about 18 pixels, right? So let's just add a modifier class of wrapper -- medium that will be a bit narrower than the default 1200 pixels. So let's save this, and then within the modules folder, let's open up the wrapper.css file. Let's create a modifier rule, medium. So instead of having a max width of 1200 pixels, if we look at our design file for just a moment, let's go ahead and give this modifier class a max width of about 976. Let's say max width 976 pixels. And if we check out the browser, there you have it. So the styling for this section is now complete. But before we bring this lesson to a close, let's see how things look on a mobile or smaller screen. So the first thing that I notice is that this gap is too large on a smaller screen, right? So I like this amount of spacing on large screens, but let's tone it down a bit for smaller screens. So in our text editor, in the modules folder, let's open the file named pagesection.css. So this amount of vertical padding works well on larger screens. So let's wrap it in a media query, mix in let's say once the screen is large enough to be considered medium, let's go ahead and use that value of 4.5 rem. But let's set a smaller baseline padding. Let's try 2 rem. Let me resize my text editor so we can see the mobile simulator, and let me hit save. I think we could reduce that even a bit further. Let's try 1.2. I think that looks better. Next up, I think the font size for this element is way too large on a small screen. So to adjust that, let's go into our headline.css file. Alright, so this font size of 2.875 rem looks great on larger screens. So what I want to do is copy that line and let's place it within a media query that only gets applied to larger screens. So mix in, let's say @small, and then paste it in. Alright, and let's set a smaller baseline font size. I think we could afford to almost cut this size in half. So let's try 1.9 rem. I like that. But we do still want this headline to have a larger font size than this headline. So remember, this headline uses the modifier class of --small. So let's decrease it a bit as well for small screens. So here is that modifier rule. Let's move this original font size into a media query. Mix in @small, paste that in, and let's decrease the baseline font size to 1.2 rem. I think that works. The next thing that I want to adjust is the way that this image is being positioned and sized on small screens. So on large screens, I think having that image be less than full width and being horizontally centered looks all right. But on tiny screens, I just think this looks odd. I think it would look better for small screens if this image just used the full available width. Now the reason this extra spacing exists is because we have a wrapper wrapped inside a wrapper, right? So for example, if we look at our HTML, here is the div surrounding that image, has a class of wrapper, and this div is nested within another div that has a class of wrapper. Now, I can't imagine a situation where we want that nested padding effect to actually take place. So what we can do is go into wrapper.css, and let's just say that any wrapper that is nested within another wrapper should no longer have any horizontal padding. So let's just offset these values by saying padding left 0, padding right 0. Let's save that. So now we still keep this nice original 18 pixels of horizontal padding, but it doesn't get applied to any nested wrappers. And I think that looks a lot cleaner. And we still maintain the desired layout on larger screens. Perfect. That's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will begin transforming this content into the 2-column layout that we see in the design file. This is going to be a lot of fun because we can reuse that column layout pattern down below in the other sections of the site. It's going to be a great exercise in writing reusable code. Let's keep rolling along, and I will see you in the next lesson.